Hey everybody, hopefully you are doing well. And so I just wanted to drop in and give us a brief introduction to this new direction we're taking in our sermon series. The sermon series we've been going through for the last month or so called Redeeming Power. And in this, we've been looking at how God views power so much differently than we view power. And he wants us to shift our view, because often we have this tendency to try to hold power over others for the sake of our own good. But God wants us to know that we have this ability to empower others for the sake of everyone's good. And so for the next few weeks or so, or even month, we're going to actually shift our direction, and we're going to see how God's love doesn't just empower us individually, but it also empowers us institutionally. And so the reason why I wanted to give an introduction before this next service is because when it comes to institutions, we really need to think about them, because institutions today don't exactly evoke the most positive of feelings. I mean, even the word institutionalized, that's not something we want to have done to us, if we're being honest. But institutions, no matter how institutional we might feel, we can't get away from them. Institutions are these realities we live in, and they help shape our relationships and the way we function within society, because all institutions are these deeply ingrained social patterns that get handed down from one generation to the next. These social patterns, they give us roles to play in society, whether that's being doctors or judges or parents or teachers. And they give us these rules, whether they're spoken or unspoken, for how we're supposed to relate to each other. And they are these things that give different groups of people different purposes and goals in life. And these institutions, they're sometimes informal and sometimes they're formal. Sometimes they might be deemed important, sometimes they're deemed trivial, but they're all over the place. Just think about globally how many pickup soccer games there are going on in dirt lots and grassy fields, but they have roles and goals and rules and all those things. But often when we think about institutions, we think about them formally. We think about them organizationally, like educationally, like universities or our public schools. And institutions are important because indeed they are passed on generationally, and they're bigger than any one individual. And because of that, they have this tendency to take on a life of their own, and the power that they have to do great good or great harm exceeds that of any one individual. I mean, just think about our medical institutions and how there are these institutions that have grown in their ability to empower people physically and even mentally over centuries. Man, they have a tremendous ability to do great good. But on the other hand, you have things like drug cartels, which have done so much harm to so many different societies, and they've taken lives away from so many different individuals. And so institutions, they're informal, they're formal, and they're all around us. And so what we're going to be doing is looking at how Jesus isn't just about individuals, but he's about institutions. For example, we're going to be diving into Ephesians 5, where Paul starts addressing all these little institutions of his time. But all these institutions, if you're familiar with Roman history, kind of all come together, kind of like the Power Rangers. They had all their little robots, and they formed some mega Power Ranger robot, right? Well, Paul starts addressing all these little institutions that, in his mind, in the mind of Roman citizens of the era, were all part of a greater mega institution called the Pater Potestas. Now, I'm not a Latin scholar, but a very fair translation of those words is daddy power. And if you can't guess, the Roman society institutional mentality of that day was highly patriarchal. And when Paul is looking at this mega institution and he's speaking into them, into the lives that inhabit them, he's speaking to a culture that saw men as the center of both their small institutions and greater, larger social institutions. And the way it functioned was men were given the highest managerial position over their wives. They had complete authority over their children, and that's how they viewed parenting. They had absolute power and ownership of the slaves in their society, and even some of the servants if they were free. And so what Paul does is something so probably countercultural today. And when he's saying Jesus matters to these institutions, and he's saying he doesn't come from maybe with a more conservative tendency that many of us take today and says, all these institutions, they're great. We need to preserve them, because if we don't preserve them, then our society is just going to fall apart. But on the other hand, when he starts speaking to this institution and the little encompassing institutions, he doesn't take the progressive mentality as well, where he's like, Viva la revolution, bring out the guillotine, right? Like, he doesn't just want to destroy them and remove them, but he takes more of a transformational approach. He says when men are at the center of all these institutions, and when we view power very differently, when we view love as the ability to empower other people, he says it's going to have a massive effect of how we relate within these various institutions. In some cases, like Jesus being at the center and God's love being at the center of our institutions is going to create this restorative effect where the God's intended good for certain institutions are going to surface. And the decay and the corruption that we've experienced within these institutions are going to slowly start falling away. In other cases, when God is at the center of these institutions, we're going to see that these institutions evolve so much so that these institutions look like a completely different species. And in some cases, we're going to see how Jesus' love means that these institutions are set on a very definitive trajectory towards for them to dissolve. Especially because there are institutions in our world which were created with the intent, purpose of harming people and robbing power from people. And so that's what we're going to do. And I think, again, this is vital for us. We need to start thinking institutionally as Christians and as people. And we need to learn how God wants us to interact with them and live with them. Because like I said, they are generational. If we don't deal with our institutions now, then our kids in our world, generations from now, are going to only experience their more negative and destructive effects, especially if these institutions are set up to rob them of the power and their ability to flourish, especially if they create dysfunction in our relationships, especially if they empower people with roles in our society that are unhealthy. And so this week, we're going to start it. My friend Kara, who is a PhD in history, and she's a great Bible teacher. She's taught on this topic. She's gonna look into the Bible and show what Jesus means for patriarchy. What does it look like for a culture that's highly patriarchal, and how does Jesus transform those perspectives? And then next week and the following weeks, I'm going to look at other institutions like friendship and marriage and parenting. And then we're going to even have an awkward but very needed conversation of Jesus and slavery. What is the Bible's actual relationship to slavery? And that is a topic that I think many of us will be surprised with, and I think we need to get a handle on this. We're also going to look at how do we live amongst some harmful institutions that exist today. So anyways, I hope you join us for the next month or so as we dive into this topic, and especially I hope you join us this Sunday as Kara talks about Jesus and patriarchy, because this is for not only our good, but for the good of our country and the good of our world. And ultimately, God is most glorified when we take these things seriously. So I'll see you Sunday, and God bless you. Take care.